Good evening, everyone. I'm Jerry Westby, and on behalf of the Conejo Open Space Foundation, I want to welcome you to tonight's talk. It's our second virtual presentation in our 2021 speaker series. We should have a large audience tonight. We had over 160 people sign up, and that's really gratifying. Tonight, we're really privileged to welcome Dan Coooper for what should be a very informative and timely presentation focusing on the bird populations here in the LA area, and more specifically in the Conejo Valley. Now, some of you may not be familiar with the foundation, or COSF as we're commonly known by our acronym. Very briefly, we're an all-volunteer 501c3 nonprofit organization with two main missions. One is to educate the public on the open space and using and maintaining the open space, and raising funds for related programs and activities. So I want to thank those of you who have made donations after registering. It's really appreciated. Besides our speaker series, donations support purchasing bike bells, for instance, that are free in the boxes at major trailheads. We also help sponsor and support Trails Education Days for all fourth graders in the Conejo Valley Unified School District. The last 2 years, we haven't been able to have that because of the pandemic, so we produced 2 videos, one each year for the fourth grade classes. And we also support the Conejo Open Space Conservation Agency's programs in myriad ways. This week, COSF donated $2,500 to the National Wildlife Federation as part of our $10,000 pledge to help construct the Wildlife Corridor Bridge over the 101 freeway at Liberty Canyon. And finally, with our new scholarship program, we just recently announced that we've awarded to 2 Oak Park High School graduating seniors $1,000 scholarships as they start their college careers this fall in environmental studies related majors. It's a renewable scholarship, so if they maintain the major and a 3.0 average and are still full-time students, they will get another $1,000 for each year of their undergraduate education. I wanted to mention those things just so some of you who aren't familiar with COSF realize that your donations are being spent for the benefit of our community. Now, coincidentally, speaking of Oak Park, we're honored to have Dan presenting tonight, as he and his family have lived in Oak Park for about 9 years, since 2012. Dan is a Harvard graduate. He got his biogeography degree from UC Riverside, and after 20 years consulting, just completed a PhD at UCLA. Through his research and independent consulting, he has conducted surveys and analyzed bird populations from desert to coast, including rare and protected species such as the California gnatcatcher and the coastal cactus wren, neither of whom I've had the pleasure of meeting, but we'll learn more about them tonight. Dan has served many environmental advisory boards and committees, including most recently on the Oak Park Parks and Recreation Planning Committee. Among his many achievements that have gained him some renown in the environmental resource management field is his book, Important Birds of California. And then finally, most recently, he has taken part in 2 recent surveys, one on raptors in the LA area and a second on birds in flood control basins in Southern California. So as you can see, we are very privileged to have Dan with his wealth of experience and information to talk with us tonight. So finally, a few words about the webinar format. Besides Dan and myself, Steve Johnson, a COSF board member, will be on hand if we run into any technical difficulties. All attendees will be muted. The presentation will be about 45 to 50 minutes with a Q&A session afterwards for 15 to 20 minutes. We'd welcome questions submitted at any time during the presentation with the Q&A tool that's at the bottom of your screen. And Steve and I will be selecting as many as we can for Dan to address at the end of his talk. So without further ado, let's get on with the show. So please welcome Dan Coooper.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jerry. And I'm delighted to be here to talk birds with people. Um, it didn't take me 20 years to complete my PhD, but I know it sounds like that from the introduction. Almost, but not quite. Okay, so we're going to be talking about urbanization and birds and how birds adapt to urbanization. So the big picture. So as our world gets more urban, and we all know it is, I'm really interested in what allows some species to thrive in urban areas and what restricts other species to wildland. And these are just some pictures from our local hills, urban on the left, wildland on the right. I'm interested to know whether this changes over time and space. And then finally, how can this knowledge inform conservation? So by 2030, I should really update this slide because I'm sure it's happening even faster. Urban cover is expected to triple from 2000 levels. It's going to lead to unprecedented pressure on natural ecosystems. So let's get into it. How do we measure this? What is urban cover? I'm defining urban cover as human developed land. This could be commercial areas, residential areas, houses, roads, schools, anything that's dominated by non-native trees and vegetation. So as you walk around and hike around the area, you'll go to an area like Cheeseboro Canyon or Sodwewa and see all those open hills, and that's largely native, even though the understory might be invasive grasses. We're considering that wildland. Whereas in the city, where most of you live and drive and shop, that's urban. So ecologists for some time have pointed out that there exists this urban bird syndrome. And that just means a collection of characteristics that define urban birds. And so that can be kind of like body size. It can be physical characteristics about birds. Researchers have found that depending on the bird, you can have urban individuals or urban dwelling individuals tend to have a smaller body size in raptors and yet a larger wingspan in songbirds. Behaviorally, they tend to be generalists. They tend to be bold. FID is flight initiation distance. So the distance between you and the bird, if you can believe it, a lot of ecologists have measured this distance and have found that urban birds tend to have shorter flight initiation distances, whereas wildland dwelling birds, it's longer. And you can think of this as you go hiking, you might flush a hawk from 500, 600 feet away, whereas in the city, there might be a hawk perched right on top of you that just doesn't care that you're there. And that just tends to be this urban-rural divide. They tend to be innovative in that they look for and use novel nest substrates. They tend to be earlier nesting, and a whole host of other things, and ecologists just continue to argue about these. In terms of conservation, we just have to, I think, agree that urban tolerant birds are generally going to be less vulnerable to extinction. In other words, if something's going to go extinct, it's probably not something that lives in the city. It's probably something that lives in a pristine environment, and as that environment gets degraded and altered, that thing suffers. Whereas if something is occurring in the city, it's sort of showing itself to be able to survive just about anywhere. And obviously there are a few exceptions here and there, but that just seems to be the case. So here's an example of this prairie falcon. Prairie falcon used to nest on Simi Peak right here in the Conejo Valley up until the early 70s. And now it's just basically a vagrant species. It just doesn't occur anymore. So you contrast this with, I don't know if anyone recognizes this off-ramp, but if you commute to downtown LA, you might. It's Sunset Boulevard at the 101. And a project that I've been working on with Friends of Griffith Park found a hawk nest in the middle of this circular off-ramp. And it was a Cooper's hawk when we found it. It's now a red-tailed hawk this year, but it's pretty remarkable. You can stand on the Home Depot parking lot roof and see the young as they hatch. I would say that if you're going to nest there at the Sunset exit of the 101, you're probably urban tolerant and arguably are less vulnerable to extinction than a prairie falcon. Okay, and then I really was interested in what traits are correlated with urban tolerance in nesting birds. And then more importantly, does this change over time? So does something start sort of urban tolerant and lose it and then just decline? Or does something start sort of wary of the city and then is just able to adapt and evolve and then explodes and becomes common in the city? So I'm looking at kind of these three dimensions. I'm looking at species, geography, and time. And for species, my dissertation and a lot of my research recently has focused on these diurnal raptors, so eagles, hawks, falcons, and also nesting landbirds. And geographically, I live in the Malibu Creek watershed. A lot of you probably do too. I frequent the LA Basin because I grew up in the LA Basin and most of my professional contacts are there. So I keep getting work calls, bringing me back to LA. And then I'm also looking at these patterns on a global level for the third chapter of my dissertation, which is in review right now. And then on the temporal scale, I'm able to go back to the 1970s with bird records in the Conejo Valley, Upper Malibu watershed, thanks to a number of researchers who were working in the area as the parklands were being dedicated. So Malibu Creek State Park, what's now Upper Las Virgenes open space, which had been Amundsen Ranch. Those areas had allowed ornithologists to come in and map raptor nests since the early 1970s. And I was given access to this data by Lena Lee of the National Park Service. And Lena actually did her master's at UCLA in the mid 2000s and looked at some of the same changes I've looked at. And now I'm updating her work on top of this old work. So here's my neighborhood of Oak Park, then and now. So we'll start with the Malibu Creek watershed study, and that is looking at the response of nesting raptors in an urbanizing landscape from the 1970s to the present. My main goal here was to see which species tend to nest near or far from urban areas, and then more importantly, can this change over time? And I'm really interested in nest sites because when you think about it, nests are the things that tie the organism to the land, right? Because a hawk can just fly around and, sail through the air, and you don't really know what habitat it's using or what it cares about unless you maybe have a GPS tracker on it and it could calculate exactly where it is at every moment, but that's usually not the case. So a quick and easy way to do it is just find the nest. And when you find the nest, that tells you a lot about what the hawk likes, what it's interested in eating, what it can take, what it can't take. So I'm interested whether nest site availability plays a role in the distribution of these raptors, whether it sort of tracks available habitats. So remember, as the area got more urban, we presume that hawk nesting territories also got more urban. They kind of follow that urbanization, or maybe they don't. Maybe they get pushed away by urbanization. That's also possible. So I was interested in this urban preference or bias, whether it's retained over time. And I'm also really interested in native trees versus non-native trees, because as a lot of you know, if you drive around our neighborhoods, practically every tree you see is non-native, whether they're pine trees from the Middle East or they're eucalyptus trees from Australia, they've been brought over here. Now we do have some oaks and a few cottonwoods, sycamores, but mostly in the city, even the sycamores are not native. They're a hybrid with London plane. And so those things weren't around in the early 70s like they are today. And so the degree to which raptors can adapt to these things can tell us a lot about maybe the future, their ecology, and like how they'll do in the future. Then for my Los Angeles Basin study, I was looking also at adaptation and looking how ecological traits of these birds explain distributional changes in an urban bird community in the LA Basin. And for this, I used two community science data sets of nesting birds. I used the Breeding Bird Atlas in the early 1990s, and then I used eBird, which is this online platform that people send in their sightings to. And I wanted to know what nesting landbird species are associated with urban habitats. And then looked at which ecological traits of those birds are associated with those same urban habitats. So tying those two together. So I'm going to first talk about raptors, then we'll go into the land birds of LA. So here are the raptors. Some of you may recognize this, 1950s, that's around Las Virgenes Road and the 101. And then that other view on the right is around Lindero and Canaan, that area. So nesting raptors are just ideal study subjects. They're globally distributed, broad range of nest types and tolerances, from stick nests to metal platforms to a building ledge. Nests are often reused. Right? That's key for looking at temporal changes. You can refine the same nests that you may have found in the 70s and see what they're up to now. They're apex predators. You know, nothing eats a hawk, really. And then, sorry, that's kind of abrupt. And then looking at urban tolerance, we want to know whether populations are increasing or decreasing. And that's kind of hard because, you know, effort changes. You might have 100 people on a count one year and 10 people in the next year, and they might go to different areas. For these online platforms like eBird, we really don't know much about effort. We don't know if they're paying attention or they're not, or maybe they can't identify a hard to identify species. So that's a challenge too. But to the best of our knowledge, we can surmise based on just the number of records pouring in on these different platforms that Cooper's hawks seem to be increasing. There seems to be just more of them out there, more people seeing them, in breeding in more areas, whereas others like red-shouldered hawk and also golden eagle and white-tailed kite seem to be decreasing. It's the opposite, fewer sightings, fewer records. But we really have to use land use and land cover data to make our arguments because the land is constantly changing, right? There's more urbanization spreading across the land. So if we're trying to connect the bird behavior to the amount of urbanization, we actually have to quantify that urbanization. We can't just say like, yeah, it's a lot more houses now. That's not science. Okay, so where's our study area? Right here. I looked at basically this whole watershed outlined in the dashed lines. And my 6 focal species included red-tailed hawk, red-shouldered hawk, Coopers. You can read the rest. Now for these species, there's been some contradictory information about their urban tolerance and their decline. So if you read some literature, red-shouldered hawk is this sort of amazingly adapted species that nests in backyards and is doing great. But then if you read other studies, it's not doing so well. It's actually pretty scarce. And we also know that some species are protected and rare. And then some are rare, but not protected. So we're going to try to sort that out with this research. So let's get down to the nuts and bolts of how do we even start? How do you determine an active nest? A nest is newish looking, it's well maintained. We wanted to see 2 adult birds. And this research, I should say, if I haven't, was done between 2017 and 2018, myself and my techs. Whether there is a pair of species within 100 feet, whether we were lucky enough to observe nest building, such as carrying sticks, food carrying, that's a good clue that you have a nest. Young visible in a nest, oh, that's an active nest. Fledglings capable of flight, that's good. So sometimes if you're late and you miss the whole build up to the nest, all you see are some fledglings hanging around the neighborhood, but that's okay. If they're sort of close, then they're probably from that active nest. All right, so let's take a look at the data that we have. So like I said, we had this 1970s data from National Park Service. Some of these folks are still around. Pete Bloom is a raptor biologist today. Glenn Olson is a vice president at Audubon, California, National Audubon. They were the names on these old raptor nests, which is pretty cool. And I worked with both of them, which is odd. But here we are, you know, years later. If you wait long enough, your data becomes historical, and then you can do a historical comparison. And this is what it looks like. So in 1980, there was a Cooper's hawk nest up here near the duck pond in purple. And then few years ago, a red tail showed up here near Deer Hill Park. I have this Cooper's hawk that I found in a cottonwood driving up Sunnycrest. Don't tell anyone about these. No, that's okay. We don't just disseminate this data, by the way. And most people would have no idea where this is. These are all close to me. One of my favorite condo dwelling red tails here. So anyway, we've got a lot of good data. Let's see how the area's changed though. The area has gotten more forested, more trees. There was weird music back then. There's a Canary Island pine and a Washingtonia palm. On the right. On the left, nothing much, no trees. There's my street. And there's a Shamel ash. So that on the right, this is winter, but that leafless ash is just the dream tree of the Cooper's hawk. And this is a big tree. It might be 20 or 30 years old, maybe older. And that doesn't exist in 1967. So the take home is we've created an urban forest where once there was cows. All right, let's visualize urban tolerance. So the crux of this study is like, what happens to these nests as the city expands? So here we have a nest surrounded by the hawk's territory, and it's sort of at the edge of the city. It's outside the city, but the territory just barely gets into the city. Now, the territory, okay, so if something is maintaining its urban tolerance, then as the city expands, the territory shifts to the extent that it maintains the same amount of urbanization in the territory as the city grows. So there's the city getting bigger, but look, that nest shifted. It went farther away because it wanted to maintain that same amount of urbanization. So that's one way something can be urban tolerant, right? It didn't disappear. It just sort of, scooted out of the way. And now let's look at urban preferring. So this is a case where as a city expands, it doesn't scoot out of the way, quite the opposite. It goes toward the city and maintains its nest and its territory squarely within that city. So that's another model that we call urban preferring. Oh, but look, there's a third, urban avoiding. So urban avoiding is when it really runs away from the city. So as the city expands, your species and your nest tends to be farther away. So what are these hawks doing? A, B, or C? We've got to figure that out. So to figure that out, I went back in time to the UCSB aerial photography library, and I found these amazing aerial photos from the 70s, and I redrew or recreated the urban boundary that was present in the 1970s, converted it to a shapefile which could be readable with GIS. And, it's not the best artistic rendering in the world, but it'll do, because all we really need to know is this urban or not? And then was this urban or was it not back then? So as you can see, the urban cover in our study area about tripled between 1975 and 2010. The human population doubled. Kind of makes sense, right? Because we've sprawled more, right? So even though the human population doubled, our footprint has expanded. But I think we could agree that there's been very little change since 2004. There have been a few subdivisions, a few custom homes, but by and large, since the mid-2000s, we've sort of kind of been built out in the upper Malibu Creek watershed. I calculated the amount of urban cover around these nests. So I looked at early, middle, and late, and looked to see whether these territories were more or less urban today. This is just for fun. I threw this in. This is another freeway interchange nest, red-tailed hawk. It's no longer there. It blew away. And to try to figure out how urbanization changed within these territories, I took the mean, the current mean, which is this big, thick black line on the right. That's the mean percent urban cover. And I took all the old means and I kind of shook them up and did it again and did it again and did it again. And then I plotted the distribution of those means. It's called a permutation test. It's sort of advanced statistics, but what you have to see, what the only take home would be that the current mean is really different from the old mean. In other words, the current urbanization of red-tailed hawk territories is a lot higher than that in the olden days. But it's not higher for American kestrel. So American kestrel had very little development around its nests then, and it is very little now. What I also did was, well, what if you had unlimited choice? Like you're a hawk and you can nest anywhere. Would you nest today in a more urban or less urban environment? All right. So what I did was I plotted 100 random points across the study area, and I calculated the urban coverage around those and did that same percent urbanization cover with random points and known points. So I compared those. Right, observed versus random. So where are these hawks going? I repeated it for each era. So we're going to have an early, middle, and late comparison. Right, observed and random. So for red-tailed hawk, in the early days, there wasn't much urban cover around these nests. And in fact, if you just plotted 100 points using those old vegetation maps from UCSB, it sort of was the same as random. There just wasn't much for them, wasn't much urbanization for them to nest in. And that sort of is held, even as the area has gotten more developed, they're still sort of the same as random. They don't seem to be preferring urbanization or avoiding urbanization. And if you know about birds and can think of red-tailed hawks that you see, they sort of keep to the edge of wildland. They sort of are not all the way in the city, but they sort of hug that edge, and they build a lot of their nests in these big pines and trees right on the edge. So here's the visualization of it. Just maintains a quarter of their territories in the city. Seems to be what they do. But Coopper's hawk has a completely different strategy, right? So in the early era and in the middle era, it was kind of like a red-tailed hawk. It was just sort of, the distribution was sort of where its nests ended up. It wasn't particularly urban. It wasn't particularly biased toward wildland. But recently, it's gotten a lot more urban. And the reasons for this could be that it's found some resource in the city that it likes. So maybe rats, squirrels, maybe the wildland habitat isn't as suitable. And you can think of all the fires we've had as sort of knocking out all those oak trees that Coopper's hawks like to nest in. And maybe it just finds the city more attractive to meet its needs. But there's the evidence from my study. So it's actually doing this. It seems to be doing this. I don't know, I can't say it's doing this throughout its range, and I can't even say it's absolutely doing this here, but that's what the evidence suggests. And in fact, it's sort of corroborated by this LA raptor study we're doing now, where we've tracked 500 hawk nests since 2017. And Coopper's hawk and red-tailed hawk are about equal in number, but all the red-tails are in the hills, and most of the Coopper's hawks are in the San Fernando Valley and Mid-City LA. So it's sort of bearing out in LA as well. But what are kestrels doing? Kestrels seem to be getting even less urban than the other hawks. And I don't know when the last time you saw a kestrel was. It's used to be called a sparrowhawk, but it was probably when you were out hiking and not when you were out shopping, because it lives way out in the boonies. It's actually doing this. It's doing that urban avoiding pattern. And of the 500 hawk and falcon nests we've tracked since 2017 in LA, we've tracked 0 kestrel nests. They are gone as nesters from LA. If we look at use of non-native trees, we see that, in fact, the use of non-native trees, which is NN, is really increasing. And we can look from left to right. So red-tailed hawk early, red-tailed hawk middle, red-tailed hawk late. Over half the nests are in non-native trees. Look at Cooper's hawk. When Lena Lee was doing her study in 2005, all the Cooper's hawks were nesting in native trees, oaks, willows. And today it's less than a quarter are nesting in native trees, at least that we found. But we're pretty good at finding nests. Red-shouldered hawk is about the same. It kind of take it or leave it. It's just this kind of interesting pattern. And that probably allows these birds like Cooper's hawks to thrive in the city. So red-tailed Cooper's increased use of non-natives, red-shouldered hawks sort of maintained. We've had no use of non-natives or white American kestrel. And interestingly, there are no more white-tailed kites or golden eagles in the study area. There were historically. There was a golden eagle territory for many years up Triunfo Canyon Road. That's no longer there. It's kind of interesting. And kestrels used to be all over the place. Okay, so raptor species can change urban tolerance over time, especially Cooper's hawks. Non-native nesting substrate use seems to be important. Sample size is a little low, only 6 species. So we want to expand this to a bigger group of birds. And so now we're looking at nesting songbirds. So we're moving to the LA Basin. Why the LA Basin? Well, it's got this long history of ornithological inquiry, active birding community for over 100 years, like this dapper fellow. We're looking at 2 main data sets, the 1990s and then more recent eBird data. And the way we did this was we used this breeding bird atlas. And these are 5 by 7 kilometer boxes surveyed by over 100 observers in the late 90s. And those are the boxes. We restricted it to below 2,000 feet across the LA Basin, including out here to Agoura Hills, almost to Conejo Valley. Cooper's hawk breeding status in the 90s looked like this. They broke it down by possible, probable, and no report. And then 15 years later, it looked like this, a lot more. And so I kind of retrofitted this eBird data using the same criteria that the breeding bird atlas used with safe dates, and basically the same criteria. So then, now, if you look at the South Bay, like Redondo Beach, Hermosa, it's really filled in across to Carson. So kind of interesting. Seems to be expanding. So I looked at 53 common and widespread nesting birds. I assigned them a breeding score, just like they did with the breeding bird atlas. I used vegetation to determine the urban cover within each of those 70 plus blocks. And I generated this urban index. And that's just a correlation between the 0, 1, and 2 of the score and the percentage of urban cover within the block. So you can think of it as how urban a bird is within its range. So if you look at these breeding scores, Cooper's hawk was on 112 blocks then, and more recently, 135. So that's a pretty good spread. If we look at all of our birds, we have a number of birds which have expanded in recent years. In other words, the later survey has them on more blocks, and fewer on the early surveys. So there's our familiar American kestrel, right? We already knew it was avoiding urbanization. Here's sort of corroborating evidence. Seems to be on very fewer blocks today. Interesting, Brewer's blackbird. You know, if you know birds, you think of this bird as the parking lot bird or French fry bird. And I'll challenge you to find a nest because it has experienced one of the sharpest declines of any bird species in California, which is sort of a mind bender because it just is so familiar. But, you know, nature changes. So there it is. So we have these very clear adapters, urban adapters. Allen's hummingbird is one of them. Seems to be everywhere. Sedentary, non-migratory. Costas hummingbird's a little migratory. It likes arid vegetation as opposed to lush. seems to be less common today, but maybe not. We'll see in a sec. But for my research, I was really interested in this change, this like adaptation or evolution of taste of birds, right? Are they changing their taste? They no longer like the wild land and they like the city life. You might see more Western bluebirds than blackbirds in town, which 20 years ago, if I had told you you wouldn't have believed me if you were a birder. But in fact, bluebirds are everywhere now. So let's look at that urban index, which is how we relate the block score to the percent cover. And you can see that early on, Cooper's hawk was negative. So it was avoiding urbanization. In other words, the blocks that it occurred on tended to be ones that had a very low amount of urbanization. And the ones where it avoided had a high urbanization, like the San Fernando Valley. Well, today it flipped, right? It's now reversed. Now the blocks that it occurs on have a positive urban correlation. So that's surprising. And so we can look at a few more like Cooper's hawk, hooded oriole, more urban. And then spotted towhee, quail. You know, you don't go to a city to see a quail. They wouldn't occur there. And they seem to be avoiding cities still. So these are getting more urban. And very few species are getting less urban. It's kind of interesting. So even though quail are not in cities, it's not like they're becoming less fond of the city. They don't like cities. They still don't. I didn't publish, feature this in my publication because I don't think the broader audience cares, but I kind of think you guys will find it interesting. These are the birds that are the most urban. So the ones that changed the most between the early days in the 90s and the current days in the 2000 teens. And I can't tell you how many times people have told me, hey, I think I'm seeing more juncos than I did. I think I'm seeing more orange crown warblers. There's something going on with song sparrows. And it's true. You drive around, the flats of Sherman Oaks and there are song sparrows nesting in people's gardens, which didn't happen in the past. So looking at the life history traits, what is causing this? Like, is it migratoriness? Is it body mass? Can we correlate any of these things with these patterns? And there have been some studies doing that with other birds. So I just put these to the test. And I was able to confirm that, yes, it is most of these are supported by prior research, including a positive correlation with urban tolerance and body mass. In other words, bigger birds, I think. Nest height, the higher the bird tends to nest, the more likely it'll be around. Ground foraging, birds don't like the city. So, see all these others. But I don't know if these are true in every case. There are a lot of associations. I think this was a typo from before because I think that it's actually negative for body mass. But anyway, birds that are most closely associated with urban areas of Los Angeles tend to be those that nest in structures. It's sort of a circular argument. If they're going to nest in a structure, well, yeah, they're going to like the city because we have a lot of structure. So house finch nesting in your lamp on your porch, that's a classic. Mourning dove in your rain gutter, another one. They tend to be sedentary. Omnivory turns up again. Then birds that are avoiding urbanization, yeah, these do tend to be large-bodied. So like the quail's avoiding it. Flicker doesn't seem to nest in the city at all. In fact, in the Santa Monica's, flicker is a rare nesting bird. It used to be common all through LA, Griffith Park. It no longer breeds there. Whereas Nuttall's woodpecker, this little woodpecker, is really common in backyards all over town. So that kind of bears it out. But we don't want to cherry pick this stuff. We want to do a proper model because, we trust statistics and not, our own assumptions. So diet specialists don't fare well in cities. Not that surprising. Like I said, a lot of exceptions, and I'm continuing to study this. Find it interesting. All right. So I'll sort of wrap up by conservation thoughts and some deep thoughts on conservation. Removal of dead trees really bothers me. We had a pretty healthy liquid amber that the county made us remove, and I didn't protest it. I just paid the fee. But we have a mostly dead liquid amber now in our front yard, which is being used by 6 acorn woodpeckers, a pair of bluebirds, Nuttall's woodpecker. These things are really attractive to a lot of wildlife. Wood boring beetles. Just a lot of stuff lives in a dead tree. And this is an actual American kestrel nest site, which I'm sure a lot of you have hiked next to. It's a very popular trail at Cheeseboro. So you might even recognize this tree if it's still standing. But it was being used in 2018. And this is exactly what kestrels like. And this is like, this strikes terror in the hearts of a city manager. So, consequently, a lot of these dead trees are not allowed to be in residential areas. So they're only found on the wildlands. But even as I say that, there are exceptions. So just 3 or 4 days ago, we got an email from a colleague who photographed 5 American kestrels, 3 young and 2 adults, huddled together on a ledge at the DWP building in downtown LA. And a colleague went and tracked it down, and they have a nest cavity in the roof of the Amundsen Theater. So this is one of the 2 kestrels we've ever found in LA, and it's not coming from the middle of Griffith Park. It's coming from the middle of downtown Bunker Hill, So what is it about downtown LA that attracted a kestrel? We can't buy one out here. I don't really know. They need a cavity, but there are building ledges out here. So, nature will continue to surprise me, as I'm sure it continues to surprise you. But that's just interesting anecdote. And then just for the last slide, I'll just sort of rant a bit, and then I think we'll open it up to questions after this. I just threw these in because people ask, what can I do? What can I do? And I just say, ask your gardener to rake instead of leaf blow. That's one thing you can do. He works for you. You don't work for him. Mine doesn't leaf blow, and he was perfectly fine with it. And so, as you sit there trying to do your work on a Wednesday and you have the succession of neighbors leaf blowing all around you, just think of all the critters and life that are just being blown away. And, in the city, we can plant native plants, and we can trim in the fall and winter and not in the spring and summer when birds are nesting. So there are all sorts of things, look inward, look around your house and see what exactly you are doing. If you are favoring cats and rats and not wildlife, well, maybe sort of dial that back a little bit. And then with a poison, obviously. So some of these things come up. And I know, quite controversially, I mentioned bird feeding. I put bird feeders out. I'm not saying that you have to stop all bird feeding, but just sort of do it at a reasonable level. And if you're attracting rats and you're sort of creating a dependency, then maybe hit pause for a few months. So I'm going to hit pause now. No, I have one more slide. Oh yeah, definitely enter sightings to these online platforms, such as eBird, I mentioned, iNaturalist. iNaturalist is photo-based, so you click a photo on your smartphone, upload it, and then researchers like myself get to use all that information, which is just brilliant. And then eBird is your species checklist that you can enter. All right, so I've got some acknowledgements from UCLA, my committee, and then some data analysis. I was telling Steve Johnson that I had no idea what computer programming was before 2017, but it's been a steep learning curve, and it's been a lot of fun. So ask me anything about R. All right. So should we open it up for questions now? You want to do stop share? How do you want to do it?
We can open it up for questions. We had one coming in early here from Max. Are you currently investigating how the Woolsey fire affected things compared to 2017 and 2018?
Oh yeah. I was working with someone doing a master's with this as her project, and sort of dropped out of communication. So I was hoping to do that. I think it would be a great study. I'm trying to think when we stopped. Yeah, we actually collected through spring 2018. So we could definitely go back and see if things are coming back. I actually did it with a Griffith Park fire. I did point counts and transects before and after that. And it took about 5 years for the community to really come back. And I don't think we found any species that were knocked out by the Griffith Park fire, even within that burn zone. So things do come back. It just takes a few years.
Another question here from Susan Bacchus. How do you know that the red-tailed hawk nest at the 405-101 blew away?
Because I pass it every day. No, I really did. I was sitting at that intersection, staring in traffic, and I was getting smaller and smaller. So what happens with these hawk nests is they are susceptible to wind and rain and everything else. And the hawks need to constantly weave in new sticks. And even through the breeding season, you'll see them bring in new material and kind of weave it around their young. And they didn't do that.
Huh. And Russell, who's our board member, don't Cooper's hawks have a somewhat different diet than other raptors in that they eat mostly smaller birds? Would that help explain their preference for urbanized areas?
Definitely. And kestrels have a very different diet too. There are a lot of factors that we can look at that would explain this. Often body size is sort of a surrogate for a lot of different things, for wing length, for mass, even for prey size. So some of our variables kind of represented other variables, but yes, I mean, definitely, I think we looked at diet breadth too, and Cooper's hawks have a very broad diet, but even that's problematic because red tails also have a broad diet. They'll eat snakes and birds and everything else. So it's basically big stuff eats big stuff, little stuff eats little stuff. Now, the question is there more little stuff in the city, right? And that comes up again and again, but unless you're doing some sort of sampling, it's hard to answer that question. So I don't know.
It does kind of make common sense though, doesn't it? That
it does,
might
yeah.
be happening.
Yeah.
Here's an interesting one from Janet. Can you please elaborate on overwatering changing bird behavior?
Yeah, our area has gotten wetter and wetter in the city, even though we're in this mega drought. If you look at those old photographs and the video with Take Me Home Country Roads, you'll see that we lived in an arid fairly arid Mediterranean environment without permanent water sources. Medea Creek wasn't a creek per se. It was sort of a dry, ephemeral arroyo. If you go back, and right now we've just added a lot of, we call it anthropogenic water across the landscape. That's brought in a whole bunch of different birds, but it's sort of driven out at the same time. You can only fit so many birds in an area or wildlife in an area. So what it's done is sort of alter the natural community that was here originally. Not necessarily a bad thing. Like, I definitely put it below leaf blowers, but it is a force of change in the natural community.
So is the impact of the leaf blower because it's clearing off the ground cover and seeds and food sources?
Yeah.
Or is it just the obnoxious noise from the leaf blower?
Well, just pick one reason. No, a lot of our nesting birds in the cities are foraging on the ground or near the ground in the shrub layer. You think of in your yard, what do you see? White-crowned sparrows, California towhees, a western bluebird coming down for a bug. All that stuff's in the ground level. So if you're constantly removing that stuff, you're creating kind of this sterile astroturf, gravelly kind of environment that, while it may save you a buck on water, it is, affecting what wildlife gets to live here. Yeah, and the noise is interesting. So the noise, we've thought about this a lot with our LA Raptor survey. Are birds bothered by noise? And I think it's constancy versus surprise is key. I've noticed that when we find a backyard hawk nest, it's in a house where the car goes right into the garage. There's not a big backyard for activity. It's just on the Hollywood Hills, maybe, where there's just this big tree plunked between houses, and there's not a lot of change. And so even though it's developed, they like things to be the same every day and predictable. And, this tragic drone crash in Orange County, which I think most people read about, where it caused these seabirds to abandon their nests. Hawks fly over that colony all day, and the elegant terns fly up and go crazy and chase the hawk away and come down. It's that novel kind of surprise thing that really kind of gets the birds out of sorts. And I think that's just something to keep in mind, just living around them.
So the consistent sound could explain why the hawks had nested in that open loop area, the Sunset Boulevard exit from the 405 or the 101.
Yeah.
Interesting. We have some interesting questions here.
Yeah.
Could you comment on the Malibu area's parrots?
Yep, they are Nande conures. They're also called black-hooded conures or black-hooded parakeets. They are an extremely loud species, and I think they're from South America. Parrots in LA are the result of people's continual releasing of parrots, and they go in waves of trends. So back when one species was popular in the 80s, you saw a lot of those, and now you're seeing different ones. So they've also partitioned the city in interesting ways. So that species ecology, it's a cavity nesting bird, like a lot of parrots, and it prefers sycamore cavities. And so it sort of tracks the distribution of big sycamores from Big Sycamore Canyon, and it goes east to about Pacific Palisades. And then it kind of drops off, and we don't get him hardly ever east of the 405. So that's why you think of it as the Malibu parakeet.
Now, I've hiked a lot around the area in Sycamore Canyon, but I've not seen parrots. Are there many of them out here? Or are they more closer to Los Angeles because that's where they're released more frequently?
There are more species and definitely more numbers of parrots in places like the San Gabriel Valley. But yeah, I think if you started your hike thinking I'm going to see a parrot today, you'll probably see them.
Okay, well, there goes tomorrow.
Expectations.
Here's another one about some of our local birds. The Woolsey fire had quail in our front yards, but they have moved back into the burn zone.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, during the Laguna Hills fire in the 90s, I think, early 2000s, people were mentioning seeing wren tits and other things temporarily in their yards, and very quickly they kind of moved back. That's interesting. Makes sense.
Here's an observation from David. I was up at the north end of Lake Piru a couple of weeks ago and came across some brown-headed cowbird traps. Can you speak to the extent of this problem, if it's a problem?
Yeah, I just had a song sparrow feeding a cowbird today on the LA River in Sepulveda Basin, actually. It's a parasitic species, so brown-headed cowbird lays its eggs in other birds' nests. And as part of wildlife management, it's often a prescription to set up some cowbird traps to help some nesting bird that's in decline. And Piru Creek, there may be a population of Bell's vireo, which is federally endangered. And so as part of the management regime of that creek, the Forest Service or the manager has agreed to trap cowbirds. It's obviously not a long-term solution, but it seems to be long-term in that they're just trapping for years and years and years. Yeah.
Ah, interesting.
And I will say that they work. So I cut my teeth working in the Kern River in the South Fork of the Kern River up near Isabella, where there's been a huge resurgence of riparian species like yellow warblers once they started trapping cowbirds. And we see almost no cowbird parasitism up there.
Rory Sky has a question about crows. Can you comment on what seems to be more murders of crows around? The poor brutes, or no, pardon me.
Bootios, yeah.
Bootios, yeah, can catch a break from being harassed.
Yeah, we've thought about that a lot with this LA study, because LA, you think there are a lot of crows here. LA has its share. I think we've counted like 1,500 or 2,000 in Culver City on these afternoon crow roosts. And we are definitely finding, I shouldn't say definitely, but it seems that Cooper's hawks seem to be sparser in areas around these massive crow roosts, whereas areas, and the crows like ficus trees a lot. And so when you drive around Culver City, it's street after street of ficus trees where we think of as being great for Cooper's hawks, and we're just not finding them. We actually found a dead crow on one of our territories, or sorry, dead Cooper's hawk in one of our territories down there. And we just started noticing it this year, that correlation. For the bootios, like red-tailed hawks, it may be that it's keeping them out of the city, but I don't know. It's definitely true that there are crows in the flatlands and very few crows, but a lot of ravens in the hills. There are a lot of red-tailed hawks nesting in the hills, dozens and dozens across the Santa Monica Mountains in LA, just in LA alone. So I don't know.
I used to watch flocks of crows in the evening fly from like southwest to northeast over my house. Is the population of crows increasing, or am I mistaken and those would be ravens?
They are crows. So you watch them go northeast, I watch them go northwest. So our big crow roost is along Arroyo Simi in Wood Ranch. And I kind of tracked them there one day. I'm not saying it's the only one, but it's a huge one. And it seems like every crow, in the area is funneling over Westlake Boulevard or wherever into Simi Valley and going to Wood Ranch. So they like river bottoms. That's their kind of natural habitat. And there seem to be a lot more.
Yeah. Well, when they're in that number, I guess it's a lot more impressive. Yeah. Here's a good question from Annabelle Lee. Have you studied roadrunners?
Oh, roadrunners are so rare that they barely showed up in any of the in our nesting landbirds, although they were included in that nesting landbirds. It's just that they're just so scarce. It is a species that is highly vulnerable to urbanization and roads. Mark Mendelson at National Park Service is studying them now. I don't know if it's a formal study, but they're definitely on his radar screen. They're almost like mountain lions, right? They need big places to roam. They kind of work their way around the city, but not necessarily in the city. And I had just a fascinating site on the 101 at Liberty Canyon, right where they're proposing the bridge. I had a roadrunner fly over most of the lanes of traffic to get to the median divider, then run along the median, hop up on the median, and then scramble like Frogger to the other side. So well, say what you will about the crossing, it might work for roadrunners.
Here's another good question from Marianne Jans. If you have to remove a bird nest, to clean up the container it is in her case, a plant holder by her front door with artificial succulents, can you put it back afterwards? And will the birds nest again?
I would not do it if you see eggs are young.
Right.
But if they're done nesting, sure. I mean, if you're just dying to clean that thing up and you can't wait a couple of weeks, No, I would say wait till they're done. But another interesting anecdote, we had a red-tailed hawk nest on a tree that was literally falling over into a house. And I've been meaning to write this up. We actually had a tree company with Fish and Game's permission, cut the nest out of the tree, fashion a kind of harness and put it back on an adjacent living tree. And the hawks nested the next year in that same structure. So
are there any bird species that if you do remove a nest, clean something up and then put the nest back because of that human contact, the birds won't return?
I mean, I don't know. I maybe someone has experience with it. Songbirds don't reuse the same nest from last year. They build a new nest. So yeah, don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's an interesting question though. So here's one from Barbara Bellinger, a short question. Bird feeding, is it a good factor or a bad factor?
You're feeding birds for you. I will say that. So always keep that in mind, that you're not doing the birds a favor. You're bringing birds to you so you can enjoy them. And I wouldn't say it's a terrible thing on the spectrum of horrible things on Earth, but it also just has a way of making birds dependent on you. So, you know, I wouldn't say it's necessarily one or the other, but just kind of be judicious about it. And I think the more you learn about it and observe it, you can just kind of come to your own conclusions. Like I said, I have hummingbird feeder up right now. I don't have 20 of them. I have one, but you know.
Yeah, I have bird feeders on my balcony, and I get a lot of doves.
Yeah.
Doves, are they native to this area?
It depends on the dove, but if it's a mourning dove, yeah. Your Asian collar dove is a non-native that's kind of moved in. But yeah, they're mourning doves. They're just a common urban bird. Yeah.
Yeah. Annabelle has another question, another good one. Has xeriscaping changed the bird populations?
Oh, that's a good question. And someone actually asked about non-native species before, about whether they have a role in this shift. And I haven't looked into it directly, but we wanted to look into that. We wanted to look at whether these communities of non-native birds are sort of like displacing natives. So in places like the LA River, you have munias and bishops, and you go to Huntington Beach and you have white-eyes and whitas, and it's like it's hard to find a native bird in some of these parks. So we're not seeing it in Ventura County because we're sort of insulated from this crush of non-native birds. But yeah, I was down in Mile Square Park down in Fountain Valley, and it was just like it's quite stunning. So xeriscaping, that kestrel I mentioned at DWP, if you've been down there, DWP has converted its lawn to a xeriscape, and we're actually wondering if maybe that allowed some critters to live and that brought the kestrels in. I don't really know, but I don't think, for every 100 houses, you'll see one xeriscaped. We've got to get a critical mass going. I don't know if you could see the light's kind of funky, but right. I have my native garden going back there. So I'm trying to do my part.
Don Weeks has an observation. We saw several white-tailed kites in Sycamore Canyon in December 2018, and he has a couple of long distance photos.
That's awesome. Yeah, they are still nesting on the outskirts, away from my study area, away from the Malibu Creek watershed, including the far western Santa Monica. So, yeah.
Okay. Jim Ford has a kind of I think it's a follow-up, a question on the crows. I'm not sure that he asked this.
Yeah.
Before. You can read this, yeah.
Yeah, we just have a lot of crows, and they nest in street trees all over the region, and then they just flock in the fall and winter. So like right now, you're probably not seeing massive flocks of crows, but you will in October.
Mm-hmm. Oh, is that right?
Oh yeah, they're nesting, so they're paired up. So like right now, bush tit, that little common gray bird in your backyard, those are starting to form family flock now, whereas for the last couple of weeks, they've only been in pairs and raising young. So yeah, they kind of follow this natural cycle. They got to make new crows every year. And
when I said, "Is that right?" I wasn't questioning your knowledge. Figure of speech. Thelma said you didn't mention mockingbirds and doves. We just talked about doves. How about mockingbirds? Changes in the population of mockingbirds in the area?
Not changes. Not changes. I think that suffice it to say, mockingbirds and doves are urban adapted, and they were in the 90s and they are today. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, here's one. A good question you can probably see. How is our population of turkey vultures doing? Seems like there are fewer of them.
Turkey vulture is a mysterious species. So it's, I don't know if any of the people listening have ever found a turkey vulture nest. I don't think I have.
Huh.
They're very cryptic. They nest on inaccessible cliffs and slopes. And in terms of numbers, they're highly migratory. So it's really hard to know whether the birds we see drifting around are nesting or wandering. But I haven't heard any indication that they're declining. It's kind of interesting.
We had a question come in from the chat here about hummingbirds in in Oak Park. Apparently sees more of them. And I think you mentioned to me, Dan, that the
Yeah.
hummingbird population has increased over recent years. Did I
Yeah.
understand that correctly?
Yeah. One species has, which is Allen's hummingbird.
Yeah,
And
you
then one
mentioned.
species hasn't, which is Anna's. So Allen's is the orange one, and Anna's is the gray and green one. So if you've got a feeder or a bird bath in the area, it's probably mobbed by Allen's, this orangey hummingbird. Some people think it looks brownish, but it's increased. And we've actually plotted the population of these two species from the LA Christmas bird count through the years. And in 2013, the lines crossed, and Anna's went down and Allen's went up, and that was the year they crossed.
Let's see. A quick question: is sedentary the same thing as non-migratory?
Yeah, it is.
Yes, it is. Okay. Let's see. Don Weeks again has said we saw Roadrunner several months ago on our street, and he has some pics. I think this must be the same Don who had the pics. Yep, of the kites in Sycamore Canyon. So
Okay. Well, I
now
should say that. Yeah, was that?
I was just going to say, should someone like Don, if he hasn't already, be posting those photos on eBirds?
Yeah, I would say iNaturalist or eBird, if you have the patience to do it, to learn how to do it. Once you do it, it's very easy. But kind of getting over that hump of like, oh, you hit this button, and like it's a pain just to learn it. But then I just do it like as a second. I'll just come in from a walk down to May Boyer Park and just like write what I saw. So it's very easy and quick. And yeah, Roadrunner is a great species to track,
Hmm.
particularly if you're seeing it east of Newbury Park. The population seems to be pretty good from Newbury Park west in toward Camarillo. But out here, Cheeseboro and farther east, they're really scarce.
Joni Burns has asked, I've seen a couple of really cool woodpeckers in my area near Cal Lutheran. What do we have in this region? I'm from the Midwest. They look like mini pileated peckers.
Right. They're not pileated, but if they've got red on their head, they're probably nuttals. You could also have acorn woodpecker, which has the clown face. So nuttals and acorn are the two common residential ones. Yeah.
Okay, Martha Bond has asked, do you have any insights into the decrease in mourning doves with the increase in band-tailed pigeons? I don't know if there's a correlation there, but.
Yeah, I don't know. They're ecologically pretty different. They eat pretty different food. Doves pick up little spiders and insects and seeds from the ground, and pigeons are frugivores, and they're going to be on things like ficus trees. I think pigeons, bandtails are native pigeon. It's a big wood pigeon, and they seem to be doing really well. And they've actually made the switch from oak woodland obligate species into sort of suburban tolerant species. So, I think it's more a case of just band-tailed pigeons are doing great. I haven't really noticed a decrease in mourning dove, but it might be happening, particularly as Eurasian collared doves have exploded across the region.
As you go west from the Malibu watershed toward the Camarillo Plains, is there a major change in any of the bird populations?
Yeah, definitely. The Santa Monica Mountains has its own sort of foothill bird community of things like acorn woodpeckers and wren tits and some of the ones we've been talking about. Once you drop into the Oxnard Plain, that area was like a flat prairie marshland, coastal sage scrub, and it really lacks the oak woodland species. It lacks a lot of the chaparral species, but you get a lot of unique stuff there that you don't get here. So yeah, all these little, as you drive through the region, as you go up and down, all those little changes really affect the bird populations and species makeup.
Here's one from Leslie Gorin. How have the changes to our local riparian areas affected bird populations and behaviors? I know some seasonal creeks have become year-round creeks due to urban runoff. I think we have that in Wildwood Canyon.
Definitely, yeah, and it has, undoubtedly. So species like song sparrows yellow warblers. They almost certainly were not here in the ranching days of old. They're birds that need permanent water. So with all those birds come a lot of other things like pampas grass, Washingtonia palms. You'll see palms just choking your waterways now if they're not cleared out. We just in Oak Park got a big grant to remove these invasive palms. And I don't look at it as like a good and bad thing, kind of like bird feeding. I look at it as just a change.
Mhm.
They have changed. It has changed the ecology. And so when we think about conservation and how we want nature to be, I think we just have to decide whether we want it to be like it was and sort of work toward that, or whether we want to sort of embrace or work around the changes that our behavior has created. And I'm not sure there's really a right answer for that.
Well, change is eternal.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, and I just tell people, like, the longer I work in this field, the more doubt I have about conservation and philosophy of conservation. It's, I'm not saying that, nothing's worth fighting for, because I'm just a diehard conservationist and I'm constantly advocating and writing letters against this and that. But yeah, so there are some very obvious things, like, do we need to turn this beautiful hillside of wildflowers into a mixed use retail work live space when we have vacant office spaces across the road? Probably not, right? Why do we need to do that? But, am I going to get worked up about increased flow into Medea Creek? I don't know.
Well, we'll let that question hang. um, you know, Marianne Jans, excuse me, had a long observation here, but I think boiled down, it's interesting observation. There were lots of road runners in Wildwood Park at the beginning of COVID, when the parking lot was closed and only residents were hiking. So kind of a broader question is, do you think during the pandemic that there was any impact on bird populations because of the decrease in human activity?
Yeah, but you know what? Where in other places it increased. So depending on the jurisdiction of the park, it was either open and mobbed or closed and deserted. So, I don't know if people have studied this. We found a huge increase in raptor nests in our study area in LA. On the other hand, I could drive to Silver Lake in 35 minutes. I could walk along Mulholland and Beverly Glen in the middle of Mulholland on a Saturday afternoon. So, and I did, to get the study done. So it's really hard to tease this out. I definitely believe you. Look, if you've been hiking Wildwood Park for years, I definitely trust your observations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably just too recent to know if the pandemic has had much of an impact with the changes in human behavior over the last year. Bill and Ellen asked, what is the situation with the area's owls? There seem to be a lot less of them.
Well, yeah. Probably depends on the species. I'm still hearing, I've been here 9 years, 10 years. I'm still hearing barn owls, great horned owls most nights. We are monitoring great horns on our LA project. We found maybe about 40 or 50 nests of great horned owls. So we're learning a lot about that species. And they tend to use old raven or raptor nests. They don't build their own nests. I think those two species are doing well. If you're not seeing them around in your neighborhood, it may be just changes in your neighborhood. I mean, it could be that you live in a condo complex that is using rodenticide and they've been driven off or killed. It could be that the tree they were nesting in was cut down and they just moved on to a different block. So it's really hard to tell. And they're kind of mysterious birds. We don't do a lot of surveys in the middle of the night to know.
Now, how about mockingbirds? Martha Vaughn has observed that there seems to be way fewer mockingbirds in the last 15 years.
I've heard that too. There's a professor I work with at UCLA. We've had a long running debate about. He's convinced that the mockingbirds are on the decline. I think it might be right. I mean, nature is in constant flux, and You know, just because a bird likes the city, then it doesn't mean it loves it now. So yeah, I think that maybe, you know, interestingly enough, house sparrow is a bird that's declined sharply.
Huh.
So you may still have house sparrows, especially if you have dog food laying around. You may have house sparrows, but I will say on the UCLA campus, there's no more house sparrow, and it's all dark-eyed juncos. So if you eat, you know, on the lunch tables in the food court outdoors, there are juncos hopping up on the benches and on the trash can, just like house sparrows would, and zero house sparrows. The first house sparrow you come to is down at sunset, walking down from campus.
So we don't know if there's been an increase in their predators or just what the result of that change, or I mean,
A pathogen?
yeah.
Who knows? Yeah.
I have a question that has occurred to me. What's the purpose of birds' dawn chorus? You know, just
Oh,
before dawn, you hear birds just coming alive and singing to
I
each
just
other.
read it. Yeah, there was just a paper I read on that. And I don't know if people have a definitive answer, but it's real. And it's just like this time to define your territory and just like to separate you from your neighbors and just like announce your presence.
Uh-huh. Well, they all seem to like it.
Yeah.
They all seem to like to do it. Um, Bonnie has asked, are you concerned that iNaturalist uses geotags? She says, I'm reluctant to use it for sensitive species and herps due to poaching. For birds, I use eBird and my photos are not usually geotagged.
Definitely. Definitely. We don't put any sensitive species on iNaturalist, and it's too easy. But iNaturalist uh, masks the locations of protected species already. So you can't even give unless you wrote out the latitude and longitude or described it, it's not going to present that to the public. You'll see it on your machine, but other people won't. But for nesting birds, yeah, we don't ever put the exact location. There's an option to obscure the location.
Good information for those who use that. Christine Elowit has said, I saw a bird that looked like a zone-tailed hawk this winter while hiking in northern Thousand Oaks. Is that possible? And have they ever been spotted here by anyone else, or was that a different species?
Definitely possible. They winter in small numbers throughout the region. I think there was one in Moore Park for a few years. There's one in Ojai, or one or two in Ojai every year. There's one in Monrovia that's been annual in winter. So sure, definitely possible.
We have a lot of Roadrunner curiosities here. Barbara Bellinger said, we used to have a Roadrunner in the 80s. It seemed to eat mostly snails that loved the ivy. We removed the ivy, and I'm afraid many people use snail killers. Would that affect the Roadrunner's decline?
Probably not. It's a bird that requires huge areas of undeveloped open space. And since the 1980s, we've put a lot of roads through that open space. There are a lot more dogs and cats on trails. It's a species that just likes that open country. And shrike is the same thing. Loggerhead shrike. You know, they used to be common. Horned lizards. There's sort of a suite of species that was common up until the 80s.
Ah.
And then they just, you know, there were more snakes that people would see back then, more roadkill snakes. So yeah, even though we live in a beautiful area and they're undeveloped hills, there still are some changes that have occurred.
Mm-hmm. Danny Sue has a question. What do you think about climate change and species moving up in elevation?
That does happen. We are not really in an area where that is a concern because it's not like they're moving up from 800 feet to 1,200 feet. That's mostly a concern in like alpine areas where you have a little narrow band of habitat that's going to be knocked off the top of a mountain. So, but climate change, you know, obviously is connected to wildfire and frequency.
Right.
And so, yeah, it definitely is affecting things. And I agree that Allens are just jerks at the bird feeders. Yes.
That's he's preceded his question with Allen's is the bully bird. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Danny. Yes.
Our last question, and this has really been fascinating. Thanks, Dan, for responding to all these as well as you have. On numerous occasions, I've seen crows eating newly hatched birds in my bird bath. How big of an impact do they have on songbird populations?
Right. They eat a lot. They rob a lot of nests. Scrub jays do that too. I just had a mourning dove and a scrub jay going at it in my grapevine and my trellis here. Um, the short answer is no one really knows. I think that there are a lot of birds out there. I guess as a take home, um, it's pretty obvious, I think, to most researchers that the suburbs, particularly the suburbs with a lot of lush plantings and open space nearby, are just chock full of birds. And even though the complexion changes a little, the species sort of ebb and flow, there seem to just be a lot around, and the diversity is surprisingly high. I think that if you have enough crows concentrated in an area during the nesting season, they might make an impact.
Mm-hmm.
But, crows nest pretty far apart from other crows. It's in the winter and fall that they congregate, and then birds aren't really raising young then. They don't kill a lot of adult birds. So I think it's probably the case where the nesting birds have found a way to kind of live around crows, and crows are not necessarily overtaking populations of other nesting birds. So they seem to have worked out an equilibrium, at least for now.
At least for now.
That's been the thing. Yeah.
Well, Dan, I think that your presentation really opened up a lot of minds, and a lot of questions have come out here. But I thought it was fascinating the way you looked at the changes in bird habitats with the increased urbanization around here. Thank you so much. This has just really been a fascinating evening, and we really appreciate you taking the time and joining us.
Well, it was my pleasure. It's great to do another talk, and I saw a lot of familiar names out there. So thanks everyone for coming, and I'll probably see you in the field soon.
Exactly. Well, thank you all. I appreciate your hanging with us tonight. We had a good audience, as most people stayed throughout the entire presentation. So thanks again. We have 2 more speaker series events planned for this coming year, so stay tuned. And again, if you wanted to review any of the presentation from tonight, it will be the video will be on the COSF website by early next week. So thank you all. Have a nice, healthy the rest of the week, and we hope to see you out on the trails watching all these great birds. Good night.
Okay.